I'm wondering if Secretary Blinken, in his meetings, will raise any concerns about Chinese lending and investment in the region, and if yes, what will be the message, basically?
Humaira, you've traveled with us and heard us long enough to know that we tend not to speak in relation to any other country. We tend to have conversations with countries that are about the United States and what we can do, and in some cases, what our comparative advantage is. In the Africa strategy speech that the Secretary laid out to the continent and to the world when we were in South Africa several months ago, the Secretary made the point that the United States is ready, willing, and able to be the partner of first resort for the countries across the continent. We recognize the vibrancy, the energy, the opportunity that is presented on the continent, and that's not opportunity for us, it is opportunity for the countries of Africa to achieve with us. And that is really what we mean when we say partnership. We are not looking for a relationship that is transactional, that's extractive, that is burdensome, or leaves various countries in a more fragile, poorer state after a deal is signed.
Is that a characterization for how you guys see Chinese investment in the region?
It is a characterization of what we're not looking for. What we're looking for is a true, genuine partnership with the countries of Africa, a partnership that will allow us to unlock the potential, whether it's through trade and investment, whether it's through people-to-people ties, whether it's through deepening diplomatic initiatives to advance our interests and the interests of the countries on the continent.
Yeah, but it's no doubt that China has expanded its footprint in that across that continent. So, I mean, let me ask it differently. Is this like do you see this as an opportunity for US to deepen its ties with the countries there?
Of course. This is what the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit is all about. At the first U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in 2014, we invited heads of state and government to come to Washington to begin this conversation as a continent. Now, some 8 years later, this is another important opportunity for Africa to come to the United States as a continent to discuss areas where individual countries, bilaterally, groupings of countries, multilaterally, or the continent itself, whether through the AU or other ad hoc groupings, can work closely with the United States. We want to use this summit to deepen that partnership. We think we've made good headway over the course of the past 2 years during this administration, but there's nothing like face-to-face diplomacy. There's nothing like having the relevant leaders from across the continent in the United States for these discussions.
Can I
yes, Jenny.
Thank you. Can I follow up Chinese issues that Chinese President Xi Jinping declared that crude oil purchase will be made in the Chinese money yuan. What is the U.S. position of the hegemonic competition with the dollar as China declared the internationalization of the yuan?
What was the last part of your question, Jenny?
What is the U.S. position on the hegemonic competition with the dollar as China declared the internationalization of the yuan, Chinese money too?
Well, it is just a fact that business transactions around the world oftentimes are denominated in U.S. dollars. I wouldn't necessarily call that hegemonic. I would call that a consequence of time and convenience and history. I think the underlying point of your question is something that we can offer a bit more on, because you seem to be referencing Chinese purchases of Russian oil, if I heard correctly. We've worked with countries around the world, of course, to do what we can to hold Russia to account for the brutal war of aggression that it's waging against the people in the country of Ukraine. As part of that, we have sought to limit the revenue-making ability of the Kremlin. We put in place a number of steps, including on December 5th, a week ago now, putting into place the price cap on the export of seaborne Russian oil. We do not think that countries should be deepening their economic ties with Russia at a time of its brutal aggression against the people of Ukraine. We've put in place this oil cap so that global energy markets can continue to be stable, can continue to be supplied without providing the Russian Federation the revenue that it would otherwise accrue and in turn use for its brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. Now, a number of countries have agreed to comply with this oil cap, but even for countries that are not formally part of the oil cap, the cap has the effect of depressing the price of Russian oil. Even before it went into effect, the price of Russian oil was reduced as a result of the promise of the oil cap. Markets, of course, are forward-looking. As soon as the oil cap plans to institute it were announced, that had implications on the price of Russian oil. So whether countries are formally part of the price cap or not, we encourage them to take advantage of the implications of the price cap when it comes to the price of Russian oil, which in turn will deprive the Russians of revenue they would otherwise accrue from those sales.
Convocation Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Indo-Pacific, Clinton Blinken visit to China and South Korea, Japan. How would you describe the background of visiting the three countries at this time? And during this visit to South Korea, will he discuss South Korea electric vehicles?
Electric vehicles.
IRA's issue.
So we did announce last week that Assistant Secretary Clinton Blinken, accompanied by the Senior Director for China and Taiwan, Laura Rosenberger, and our Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for China and Taiwan, Deputy Assistant Secretary for China and Taiwan, Rick Waters, would travel to the PRC. They met with PRC Vice Foreign Minister Xie Feng in Langfang on December 11th and 12th. They went there for a number of reasons, in part to follow up on the conversation the two presidents had in Bali in November, but they also discussed preparations for Secretary Blinken's own travel to the PRC early next year. The talks were candid, they were substantive. Assistant Secretary Clinton Blinken and Senior Director Rosenberger made clear that the United States would continue to compete vigorously, stand up for U.S. interests and values, defend the rules-based international order, and coordinate closely with allies and partners. Those are the points that we make in all of our engagements with senior PRC officials. They also emphasize the importance we place on bringing home U.S. citizens who are wrongfully detained or who may be subject to exit bans, noting that it's a personal priority for the President, for the Secretary of State as well. They exchanged views on key regional and global issues, including Russia's aggression in Ukraine and the threat to regional security and stability that the DPRK poses as well. They also explored potential avenues for cooperation where our interests do intersect. That includes on challenges such as climate change, health security, global macroeconomic stability, and global food security as well. After the meetings in China, the Assistant Secretary and Senior Director Rosenberger, they traveled to Seoul and Tokyo for consultations on a range of regional and bilateral issues. They were there from December 12th through the 14th.
Lastly, excuse me, why doesn't the United States impose sanctions on China and the Russian individuals and entities to help North Korea? Why China and Russia is not additional sanctions regarding?
Well, Jenny, we're always looking for individuals who would be appropriate to sanction under our various authorities, including those authorities that are targeted at the DPRK's ballistic missile program, its nuclear weapons program, its WMD program, more broadly. If there are individuals who are appropriate for the use of sanctions, we won't hesitate to do that. we have made very clear that we will continue to hold the DPRK to account for its threat to stability and security in Northeast Asia and potentially well beyond. Yes.
Thank you. To follow up Secretary Blinken's visit to China, logistically, could you explain why the meeting is in Langfang instead of Beijing?
I would need to refer you to PRC authorities for that.
And regarding the talks, have they talked the recent arms sales to Taiwan?
Did they discuss recent arms sales to Taiwan?
Yeah.
Beyond the readout that I just provided, I'm not in a position to go beyond that. But in every senior level engagement with the PRC, we make very clear that we continue to uphold, to respect our One China policy and the elements that undergird it as we continue to fulfill the requirements that are put forward in the Taiwan Relations Act.
And when you talk about Secretary Blinken's visit to China early next year, are we talking about January or February?
At this point, we're just in a position to say early next year. I think we're at the preliminary stages of scheduling the visit, so I wouldn't want to get ahead of where we are.
And will the COVID outbreak in China have any impact on his plan to China?
Again, we are planning this. We're at the early stages of planning this with the Assistant Secretary's travel and Laura Rosenberger's travel. We've had face-to-face discussions regarding this, but we do look forward to the opportunity to continue the face-to-face conversation that President Biden had with President Xi in Bali last month when Secretary Blinken does travel to China early next year.
Which kind of interactions between this building and China will take place before Secretary Blinken's visit?
There's always a range of preparatory discussions before any senior level travel anywhere. I would hazard to guess that those discussions may be even more intensive in the run-up to Secretary Blinken's travel to the PRC, because this will be the first senior level travel during this administration to the PRC and one of the first senior level interlocutors to travel to Beijing since the outbreak of COVID in early 2020. So there's a lot of preparation to do. We're in the early stages of that, and as soon as we have more to announce regarding the details of the travel, we will.